Welcome to Pushback. I'm Aaron Maté. We are on the eve of the testimony of former Special Counsel Robert Mueller, and there's a lot of anticipation, obviously. Democrats seeing this as pretty much their last gasp for Mueller to deliver. We all know that he has not. The report found no Trump-Russia conspiracy. If you read it closely, I think it continuously undermines the case for a conspiracy, and I don't think that we can expect Robert Mueller's testimony to be any different, as evidenced by the fact that he resisted testifying, not wanting to be part anymore of a political spectacle, according to people close to him, and as he indicated in his final news conference. But that doesn't mean there aren't important questions that he should be asked, and I wanted to share some of the questions that I would ask Mueller if I was testifying him, because for all the hopes the Democrats still have that Robert Mueller will provide some kind of bombshell details, I think all that is overlooking the fact that there are still some serious questions to ask Mueller about his report, about the conduct of his investigation and of other U.S. intelligence officials, and how we got this entire Russiagate thing to begin with, how we got fixated in for over 2 years on a conspiracy theory that, as we know now, was baseless. So, my questions for Mueller are also, I also write about them in a new piece for The Nation magazine, so you can read more about it there, but I'm going to talk about some of them here. So, my first question for Mueller is, why did you suggest that a juvenile clickbait troll farm was a part of a sweeping and systematic Russian government interference effort? I ask this because Mueller, in his report, basically says that Russian government interference occurred principally on two fronts. And the first example of this that Mueller gives is of the troll farm, the internet research agency, which supposedly through its social media posts tried to sow discord, turn Americans against each other, disparage Hillary Clinton, and elect Donald Trump. Now, there's one piece of this that we've already established, which is that this picture of the troll farm as being a sophisticated operation is baseless. It was mostly juvenile clickbait. It was mostly unrelated to the election. It had such offerings as advertising a fake masturbation hotline. It also had things such as Buff Bernie memes and Jesus arm wrestling memes. And only a very small amount of it was actually related to the election. That's even according to the Senate studies that were put out earlier this year. And of course, most of the ads that Americans saw, even if they saw them at all, aired after the election. So it would be difficult for them to influence an election that way unless they were capable of time travel. So, but then there's the question of whether or not they were a part of a Russian government operation, which is the suggestion, but not outright statement, that Mueller makes. And Mueller has just been forced to basically walk back that suggestion because a court recently rebuked Mueller in the case that he's brought against the troll farm. One of the firms behind it is called Concord Management, and they're actually fighting Mueller in court, and they're fighting the indictment that Mueller brought against them. And through that proceeding, Mueller had to admit in court that actually the report was not asserting that the Russian government had anything to do with the Russian troll farm, which sort of is an embarrassment. It's an embarrassment for Mueller, and it's an embarrassment for everybody who has told us for 2 years that the Russian troll farm was part of a sophisticated Russian intelligence operation. It was comparable to 9/11 and Pearl Harbor. Rachel Maddow, I recall, saying that this was Russian intelligence at its most sophisticated. So the fact that Mueller had to essentially walk that back is a huge embarrassment, and he should be asked about it at his hearing on Wednesday. My next question is, are you still convinced that the GRU, Russian military intelligence, stole Democratic Party emails and transferred them to WikiLeaks? And the reason why I ask this question is, I realize it might sound silly. Of course Mueller is still asserting that. Well, if you read the report carefully, there's a lot of wiggle room. As I wrote recently in a long piece for Real Clear Investigations, which I'll link to below, Mueller uses a lot of qualified language when he gets down into describing the alleged Russian theft of the Democratic Party emails in his report. Instead of saying the GRU stole the emails, he says the GRU appear to have stolen emails. And he also offers up a really strange timeline. According to his account, Julian Assange would have had to have announced that he received the emails and was going to publish them before he ever communicated with who Mueller suggests is Assange's source, and before he also received the emails from that same source that Mueller suggests, which is Lucifer 2.0, a mysterious online figure who Mueller alleges is really a cutout for Russian intelligence. So the timeline that Mueller gives does not make sense because, again, basically, on June 12th, Assange announces that in a TV interview that he has Democratic Party emails and leaks in relation to Hillary Clinton. And it's only after that that Mueller says Assange first made contact with Lucifer 2.0. And then a month later, does Mueller suggest, without outright stating, that Assange got the emails from Lucifer 2.0. So the timeline right there doesn't make sense. And to underscore that point, Mueller even acknowledges that he doesn't know for sure how Assange got the emails. He suggested in the initial, in July 2018 indictment of Russian military intelligence officers that Assange got them from Lucifer 2.0, and he suggests it again in the report, but he doesn't outright state it. And he actually acknowledges, there's a line where he says, we cannot rule out that WikiLeaks received the stolen information from intermediaries who visited in the summer of 2016, which means that Mueller has no idea, despite claiming to have a really invasive window into Russian intelligence, so much so that he could see their individual keystrokes, which he reproduces in his report. Despite that, Mueller has no idea how WikiLeaks actually got the how WikiLeaks actually got the emails, which tells us that he cannot trace them from Russia to WikiLeaks. So, another question for him to be asked about. And on that front, there's an obvious question here, which is to Mueller, which is why didn't you interview Julian Assange? Mueller talked to hundreds of people, but missing from that list is probably the most critical figure because Assange received and published the stolen emails that are at the heart of Russiagate. Assange has said many times that the Russian government was not his source. People close to him have said that it came from a DNC insider. And Mueller could have at least cleared this up and gone to Assange and put all this to him, but he didn't. And that's all the more strange given that Assange has even offered previously the US government to show them proof that would rule out the involvement of certain actors in the DNC email theft, which presumably would be a reference to Russia since Assange has said that Russia was not his source. So, a curious decision there by Mueller not to interview Assange, and he should be asked about it. Okay, so now we're getting on to some of the questions surrounding the collusion aspect of Mueller's probe. Why did you imply that key figures were Russian agents and leave out countervailing information, including their more extensive Western ties? So, the key figures in this regard are two people. One is Konstantin Kilimnik and Joseph Masood. Let's take Kilimnik first. So Kilimnik is a business associate of Paul Manafort. And Kilimnik became a very big deal over the past year because Mueller at a certain point accused Manafort of lying about his interactions with Kilimnik, who again, Kilimnik is Manafort's business associate. And Mueller accused Manafort of lying about his contacts with Kilimnik, including over his sharing of Trump campaign polling data with Kilimnik. And then Mueller said that Kilimnik is someone who's been assessed to have ties to Russian intelligence. He didn't specify what those ties mean. Does that mean that Kilimnik spoke to someone in Russian intelligence, or does that mean he's a Russian agent? Mueller never specifies what he means, so he left it ambiguous, which is a recurring pattern. But that led to this impression and this widespread theory, one more claim of a smoking gun, that Manafort had shared internal polling data with Kilimnik, who then passed on that polling data to the Russian government, who then used the polling data for their non-existent, sophisticated social media operation, which again would be impossible just by virtue of the fact that the Russian government had nothing to do with that operation, at least according to Mueller, and the social media output that they produced was juvenile clickbait. But anyway, That was the theory. But the problem in all this is that while Mueller goes to great lengths to portray Kilimnik as having Russian intelligence ties in his report, he leaves out the fact that Kilimnik was actually a valued State Department source. And we've known this for a while, but a recent report in The Hill by John Solomon underscored this, that Kilimnik was feeding valuable information to the State Department and the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine, so much so that he was described internally as a sensitive source for the U.S. government. Mueller knew this, but didn't mention it. And the obvious question is why? Why did you go to great lengths to portray this guy, Kilimnik, as being tied to Russian intelligence when you knew full well that he actually has far more extensive and documented Western ties? The same question applies to Joseph Masood. Now, Joseph Masood is basically, supposedly, the predicate for the entire Trump-Russia probe, because Masood is the person who supposedly told Trump campaign volunteer George Papadopoulos that the Russians might have damaging information on Hillary Clinton and they might use that during the election. Masood allegedly told Papadopoulos this in April of 2016. Papadopoulos, a few weeks later, told this to Alexander Downer, who's a diplomat from Australia. And in July 2016, after the stolen Democratic Party emails were released and U.S. Officials and the Democratic Party were blaming, and CrowdStrike were blaming that on Russia, Downer apparently informed the FBI that, hey, back in May, I heard this from Papadopoulos, that someone had told him this. And that's what supposedly launched the entire Trump-Russia investigation. Now, Mueller in his report goes to great lengths to suggest that Masood has ties to Russia. He emphasizes that Masood has various contacts to Russia. He doesn't point out that Masood has actually deeper ties to Western circles. He taught at a couple of schools, and he taught and he lectured at a couple of schools in Europe where Western diplomats and intelligence officials often spoke and worked. He visited the U.S. In February 2017 to attend a State Department conference. And in fact, Masood was interviewed then, which raises another question. Because during that interview, Masood spoke to the FBI, and according to Mueller, Masood lied to the FBI. Which brings us to our next question, which is, why did you indict several Trump officials for perjury, but not Joseph Masood? Because, again, Mueller claims Masood lied to him, or lied to FBI investigators in February 2017, but Masood is not indicted. Compare that to George Papadopoulos and Michael Flynn, who were indicted and prosecuted by Mueller, even though if you look at the actual details of their lies, they're flimsy, to say the least, and vague. Whereas Masood, according to Mueller, lied in a serious way, but yet he wasn't indicted, which is a curious question, or a curious fact, especially given the unresolved questions about who Masood is and whether or not he's actually tied to Western intelligence and not to Russia, because there is some speculation that Masood was part of some setup effort against the Trump campaign. Next question, why did you omit that Rob Goldstone's offer to Donald Trump Jr. For, quote, official documents and information that would incriminate Hillary in her dealings with Russia as part of Russia and its government's support for Mr. Trump was, quote, publicist puff. In other words, a lie. Okay, so the email that Rob Goldstone wrote was seen widely as a smoking gun, because Rob Goldstone wrote to Donald Trump Jr. in June 2016 to set up the infamous Trump Tower meeting. And he offered Donald Trump Jr. official documents and information that would incriminate Hillary in her dealings with Russia, unquote. And he also mentioned that this was a part of Russia and its government's support for Mr. Trump. And because Donald Trump Jr. responded to that by saying, if it's what you say it is, I love it, this was seen as a smoking gun and proof that the Trump campaign colluded with Russia. There's one problem, though. Rob Goldstone, the publicist who wrote the email, was not transmitting an actual offer on behalf of Russia. By his own account, he was basically making it up. He was using, in his words, publicist puff, because he's a publicist, and his job was to get a meeting on behalf of a client of his who is Russian, who had asked Goldstone to get a meeting on behalf of another Russian, this woman, Natalia Veselnitskaya, a Russian attorney. So to do that, without having very much information, Rob Goldstone basically invented this. He invented that he'd spoken to the Crown prosecutor, which is not true because there is no Crown prosecutor in Russia. That's a term Goldstone brought from his home country of Britain. And what's interesting is, while the Mueller report acknowledges that the meeting never contained any actual damaging information on Hillary Clinton, Mueller never just outright states what Goldstone told him, testified, which is that the offer itself was a lie. And because Mueller didn't say that, it still leaves this impression that the Trump campaign received an actual offer from Russia, which is not true. They thought they were receiving an offer from Russia, but what they actually got was a work of fiction written by a music publicist trying to get a meeting on behalf of his Russian clients, which is something far different than portraying him as a Kremlin intermediary, which is how Goldstone has been widely and falsely portrayed. So it's curious that Mueller didn't clear that up. And when I spoke to Goldstone the other day, and we'll publish that interview soon, Goldstone was disappointed that Mueller didn't include that part of Goldstone's testimony. Which brings to another question on the issue of intermediaries and Kremlin contacts. Did the Trump campaign receive any actual Russian government offers of assistance from anyone actually acting on behalf of the Russian government? This is an important question because we hear often about, hundreds or dozens of contacts between the Trump orbit and Russia. But if you read between the lines and you actually look for a case when anybody in the Trump camp interacts with anybody acting on behalf of the Kremlin, there's pretty much nothing. There's only two exceptions. There's the Russian ambassador, and there is a Kremlin assistant in the Kremlin spokesperson's office telling Michael Cohen, who was then the attorney for candidate Trump, that the Russian government can't help the Trump organization in its effort to build a Trump tower in Moscow. So basically, the only two contacts between the Trump organization and anybody actually acting on behalf of the Russian government are those two cases, the Russian ambassador and a Kremlin spokesperson's assistant saying, sorry, we can't help you. And that fact has been overlooked in this effort to basically paint any possible contact between Trump and somebody with a Russian passport or a Trump associate and someone with a Russian passport or a Trump associate and someone who claims to know someone with a Russian passport. There's been this huge effort to portray all these as suspicious. So just by virtue of the fact that people in the Trump camp spoke to someone who's either Russian or knows someone who is Russian, that's deemed suspicious. But again, in terms of actual contacts between the Trump organization and actual Kremlin intermediaries, with those two exceptions, there's nothing. Which then raises the question: is like, what are we supposed to be alarmed about, or how could there possibly be a conspiracy here when there's no actual even interaction with the Trump camp and the Kremlin? And to underscore this point, Mueller even has a line where he's talking about the period after the 2016 election, and Mueller points out that even top Russian officials and elites had no contacts inside the Trump camp. I'll read you the quote. So Mueller is talking about the period after the election, and he says Russian government officials and prominent businessmen after the election began trying to make inroads into the new administration. But these powerful Russians, Mueller notes, quote, appeared to not have pre-existing contacts and struggled to connect with senior officials around the president-elect, unquote. So again, if top Russians had no pre-existing contacts with the Trump campaign after the election, how could they possibly have conspired with them before the election? And that's why it would be interesting if Mueller can name a single case where anybody in the Trump camp actually interacts with anybody from Russia or acting on behalf of Russia who's actually offering any assistance to the Trump camp. It's not there. And finally, in a question that I think helps explain why we've had this 2-year plus probe, despite the underwhelming evidence that I've just touched on, although there's a lot more to say about that. My final question today is, were U.S. intelligence officials compromised by Rousseauphobia? Because I think that's part of the problem here. U.S. officials are so driven by a distaste and in some cases hatred, by their own account, of Russia, that when Trump started saying he wanted to cooperate with Russia and he started saying nice things about Vladimir Putin, that alarmed them. And I think that helps explain why we have Russiagate to begin with, along with several other factors. It was convenient for failed neoliberal Democrats to blame Russia and to concoct a conspiracy theory to explain Trump's victory instead of looking at their own failures. It was great for the ratings of the media, who could also pretend to hold, the power to account by going after the truth behind this possible conspiracy between Trump and Russia, instead of looking at, the real sources of power in this country and the real reasons why Donald Trump was elected, not because of a conspiracy with Russia, but because of a failed neoliberal system. But in terms of this Rousseauphobia amongst U.S. intelligence officials, it's worth looking at. And it's worth wondering whether that impacted the decisions made by U.S. officials throughout this probe. For example, Lisa Page, former FBI lawyer on the Russia probe, she testified this. She said, "I do always hate the Russians. It is my opinion that with respect to Western ideals and who it is and what it is we stand for as Americans, Russia poses the most dangerous threat to that way of life." Peter Strzok, who was a top FBI agent on the Russia probe, he texted Lisa Page in July 2016, "Fuck the cheating motherfucking Russians, bastards, I hate them. I think they're probably the worst. Fucking conniving, cheating savages." James Clapper, the then director of national intelligence, after he left office, he spoke to NBC News, and he was talking about what caused alarm among U.S. intelligence officials. He said, "The Russians are almost genetically driven to co-opt, penetrate, gain favor, whatever, which is a typical Russian technique, so we were concerned." And recently, speaking to Lawfare, the former FBI General Counsel Jim Baker also helped oversee the Russia probe. He said that, talking about the origins of the investigation, he said, "It was about Russia, period, full stop. When the Papadopoulos information comes across our radar screen, it's coming across in the sense that we were always looking at Russia. We've been thinking about Russia as a threat actor for decades and decades," unquote. So that's Jim Baker. And the animus towards Russia among U.S. intelligence officials was so stark that we learned recently that not only was there an initial investigation of the Trump campaign in Russia in July 2016, but actually the FBI opened up a second counterintelligence probe in the spring of 2017 on whether or not Donald Trump was doing the bidding of Russia. And if you read the New York Times story about this, there's no allusion to any kind of evidence that made the FBI concerned, any kind of secret evidence. It's all based on public developments, and it's actually based on an erroneous interpretation of those public developments. So it says, the Times story says this: "Mr. Trump caught the attention of FBI counterintelligence agents when he called on Russia during a campaign news conference in July 2016 to hack into the emails of his opponent Hillary Clinton. Mr. Trump had refused to criticize Russia on the campaign trail, praising Putin. And investigators had watched with alarm as the Republican Party softened its convention platform on the Ukraine crisis in a way that seemed to benefit Russia." That's from the New York Times. Okay, so this is not based on secret evidence that raises the concern that Trump is a Russian agent. This is based on the FBI looking at public developments, and not just looking at public developments, but getting them wrong. So, first of all, when Trump called on Russia to hack into the emails, that was a joke at a news conference. When this whole thing about the Republican Party changing its platform in a way to benefit Russia, no. What happened was the Republicans rejected an amendment that would have included language that called for directly sending lethal aid to Ukraine. Instead, they had a line about sending appropriate assistance to Ukraine. So basically, they rejected a proposed amendment in a meaningless platform. And to underscore how meaningless this platform was, the final text about Ukraine and Russia was still more hawkish than the Democrats' platform was. And furthermore, when Trump actually came into office, he sent those weapons to Ukraine anyway, which is something that President Obama did not do. So forget whatever this meaningless platform said. In practice, Trump was an actual hawk because he sent those weapons to Ukraine. So this was the basis for a counterintelligence investigation by the FBI of the president for being a Russian agent. And it illustrates to me not how suspicious Trump's dealings with Russia were, but how unhinged the mindset was of the FBI agents who investigated him. And I think that is one of many things that needs to be raised with Robert Mueller at his hearing. And finally, I'll just say that whatever questions we may have for Robert Mueller, I think the most important questions will be those that we ask ourselves. How is it that we let a conspiracy theory and the hope that Mueller would validate it dominate our political and media culture for over 2 years? How is it that we let the Democrats take their eye off of Trump's actual policies and channel the resistance to him into a conspiracy theory, and then establish a strategy of waiting on Mueller? As the New York Times just said, there's a line in the New York Times this weekend where it says, for 2 years, Democrats have waited on Robert Mueller to deliver a death blow to the Trump presidency. On Wednesday, in back-to-back hearings with the former special counsel, that wish could face its final make-or-break moment. I think it's a very apt line. I think it's very sad, because the fact that under this president, with all that Trump is doing, Democrats chose to wait on Robert Mueller to deliver a death blow, to wait on Robert Mueller to validate a conspiracy theory, instead of being in actual opposition, instead of channeling resistance to Trump into, political organizing around his policies, not, watching MSNBC and hoping that the latest indictment or court filing would finally show that there was collusion. It was a massive political failure, and I think there are important questions to ask Mueller, and there are important questions to ask about the origins of the Russia investigation, because Mueller and other intelligence officials have made some shady decisions and helped bring us to where we are today. But I think the most important question is, how did we as a society let all this happen? And something to think about on the eve of the Mueller hearing. I'll leave it there. I'm Aaron Maté. Thanks for joining me on Pushback.